Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. And it's a special episode, kind of. Something we haven't done in quite some time, a serial killer Sunday. And you could be listening to this on a day that is not Sunday, and in that case, it's just a normal episode for you. And I've been asked quite a few times over the last year or two since I stopped doing Serial Killer Sunday why I stopped doing it. And the reason is pretty simple: statistics. People aren't really listening on Sundays, and I felt like I was putting in a whole lot of work on a Sunday for nobody to listen. I mean, people were listening to it, but that's the least listened to day, which is originally, by the way, why I started doing it. I thought, well, there aren't that many people listening on Sunday. I bet I can drive up those numbers if I do like a special episode on Sunday. And it did, it works. More people listen on Sunday than the average Sunday. But there's a lot of work that goes into it, and the payoff wasn't there, if that makes any sense. So I stopped doing it. I thought, well, people aren't interested. And then I got inundated with emails about it, as after a while after I stopped doing it. So I'm going to try to do it more often. It's absolutely not going to be an every Sunday type of thing, but I'm going to do it as often as I can. If you follow on social media, I'll give you a heads up as to when that will happen. And because I haven't done it in quite some time, I decided to make this one a two-part episode. I try to keep these episodes to 10 minutes or less, and I guess I could do that with this episode. I'd be packing a ton of stuff into 10 minutes like normal, but I figured I would just do two parts of this one. So this one you're listening to now is obviously the first part. And before we get going into it, if you are a brand new listener to 10-Minute Murder, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm assuming it's wherever you're listening right now. Hit subscribe, you won't miss any future episodes, and you won't have to go searching for it every time you'd like to listen to 10-Minute Murder. It's just always right there for you. It's absolutely free, and I think super convenient to be a subscriber to 10-Minute Murder. Also, like I mentioned before, connect on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Links are in the show notes of this episode, or you can go to 10minutemurder.com. Now, to today's story. In Chelsea, Massachusetts, on September 3rd, 1931, Albert Henry DeSalvo was born. DeSalvo, one of 5 brothers, experienced a difficult childhood, as you know is common with those that go on to become serial offenders. According to Gerald Frank's 1966 book, The Boston Strangler, his father was an alcoholic who believed in equality within his family. But that equality consisted of beating each and every single member of the family. They were all catching his hands, mom included. Now that's not a direct quote from the book, but that's what happened. But what is a direct quote from Albert came from A&E's true crime story, where DeSalvo claimed that, quote, "He smashed me once across the back with a pipe. I simply wasn't moving quickly enough." Albert, the child, who started shoplifting at age 6, developed into a delinquent, and he spent time in and out of jail for violence and petty crime. He also went to a rehabilitation academy. DeSalvo enlisted in the Army and became a boxer while in the Army. He did really well as a middleweight boxing champ among the other soldiers stationed in Europe. He began a relationship with a German woman that he met named Irmgard Beck while she was a tour guide in Germany. After getting married, they moved back to America. Despite Irmgard giving birth to a girl that had some physical disabilities, which can be difficult financially, they led modest lives and were able to support themselves. His wife, though, tried to avoid having sex with DeSalvo as much as she possibly could. She knew that he had a strong libido and thought that if she had another child with him, it would also have a disability. She wasn't able to, sorry not tonight I have a headache, enough to keep him from having a second child with her. The next baby was a boy, healthy, and DeSalvo seemed to have changed into a responsible family guy who was well-liked and respected by his boss and coworkers. But he was also known to be a wild braggart, which could be a reason why later on the police didn't believe him initially when he told them that he was the Boston Strangler. He had that embellishing reputation. By the time DeSalvo was a well-built 29-year-old, he was breaking and entering people's homes. He'd also started to dabble in peeping Tom behavior, along with some other bizarre and creeper behavior where he would knock on women's doors pretending to be a model scout. Some of the women were flattered and let him inside, where he would then measure them. And you know how much we love giving nicknames to things and people. So DeSalvo earned the name Measuring Man. And the Measuring Man served 18 months in jail for the crimes with a sexual component. DeSalvo was a factory worker and handyman when he wasn't spending time in jail during that time. A string of horrific murders in the Boston region happened between June 1962 and January 1964. Only 2 of the 13 fatalities, all of whom were female, by the way, had not been strangled. And because of that detail, the Boston Strangler is sometimes only considered responsible for 11 murders. The Boston murders were attributed to a lone psychopath, known as the Phantom Fiend by the media, and the case is still controversial. The fact that many of the victims were mature or elderly is what makes these specific killings stand out in the history of serial killing. The violence and tragedy of the events are increased by the interaction of old age, loneliness, and vulnerability. Due in part to a lack of tangible evidence, nobody was truly tried for the Boston killings, but the majority of people in the know, at least, believed DeSalvo to be the culprit.
She had always been a fan of mystery stories and considered herself an amateur psychologist. In June of 1962, Loretta McLaughlin, a reporter for the Boston American newspaper, read a small news story that piqued her interest and began to lead her on a most fascinating journey.
The way the story began for us, I think, is sort of interesting. It was summertime, 1962, and things were sort of, the news was quiet. And there was a woman, Anna Slessors, murdered, found dead over in an apartment behind Symphony Hall in Boston. The story got, I think, about 4 paragraphs on page 14, viewed as, you know, just sort of an anonymous, just passed as one of those things that happen in a city and no one understands. And then by the end of June, another woman was found strangled, only she wasn't in Boston, she was up in Lynn on the North Shore. So those things were not really connected very much by the police or anyone else. Then we got into July, and there were 2 more. And these again now were Boston women, and they were all elderly women, elderly by the standards of a 30-year-old anyway. And they didn't seem to make any sense, and no one was paying very much attention to them. And one summer day, I went up to the city editor at the time, Jack McLean, and said, if he didn't have anything else for me to do, I'd really like to take a look at these stranglings. And he sort of said, why? He said, Loretta. He said, they are nobodies. And I said, that's the whole point. Why should anyone be going around killing women who are nobody? And so I set off to try to talk to their families, try to find them, try to find out what we could about the women, but also trying to see if there was any pattern to the crimes at all. And there was, in my view. I mean, you know, it's like rank amateur, but nonetheless, I mean, there were some fascinating similarities. All the women wore eyeglasses, which might not seem so unusual in that age group, but for all 4, you know, all of the women had a very distinct musical interest. And one could fantasize about whether they were playing music and the killer came in on the waves of song or something, or was lured by that. In our area, which is a very major medical center, it also might not seem so unusual, but all women had connections to a hospital. They either had worked in one, or had volunteered, or had been visiting a relative in a hospital within the immediate time before they were killed. And that again seemed unusual to me. But most of all, it was the fact of the pattern of the crime. All women were strangled. All of the women were sexually abused, either after they were dead or at least after they were unconscious. And more than that, each one was decorated with a huge flowing loop, 1 or 2 by bathrobe cords, one with nylon stockings, another one with a silk blouse plus a nylon stocking underneath it. And though the women may have been in different areas of the city and there was nothing in their lives where you could see their paths crossing, it certainly seemed to me to be absolutely outstanding that you had a killer who not only killed elderly women, but left them in a very decorated fashion. The women also, my memory's a little short now, but I believe all 4 of the women also were left in very bizarre positions. And so one could again read in some sort of medical fantasy or something like that.
And that's where we're going to stop with part 1 of the Boston Strangler, a 2-part special for Serial Killer Sunday. In the next part, we're going to detail the different murders of the Boston Strangler, figure out exactly what happened, why his crimes were so identifiable with any other murders, what was his MO, what types of trademarks he had in the killings. And then toward the end of the next episode, you're going to hear about another person that could be involved or maybe was involved in the Boston Strangler murders. And then, of course, at the very, very end, a DNA conclusion that lets you know exactly who is responsible for at least one of the Boston Strangler murders, possibly all of them. And that's happening all in part 2.